If you're interested, Google playing for change. They also have some other neat stuff. Yeah. No. Anyway. Computers are my friend. Yep, the guy's got a degree in this stuff. Any questions about what we've been talking about? Let's talk about the different colonies in the Americas. As I said, maybe I should let that on. Yeah, that's right. As I said, the three major people involved, or three major nations involved in colonization in the Americas. Spain, along with Spain, Portugal, France, and England. The first to really work strongly on colonization were the Spanish. At that time, the Spanish were arguably the most powerful people in the Western world. Through the mistakes they made in mercantilism, plus some other drastic mistakes they made, they lose that power fairly rapidly. The French and the English, as you will find out in this class if you don't already know, sometimes it's easier to name the times when the French and the English weren't fighting when they were. I mean, the French and the English, up until the 20th century, they used to fought each other. Don't get along. The Spanish were the first. They came in, and I guess you could argue that the Portuguese were the first, since Columbus was sailing under a Portuguese flag. He made actually three voyages. The first voyage he landed in the Caribbean. And it didn't take the Spaniards long to start colonizing. They colonized really fast. And their colonies stretched from Florida, present-day Florida, and present-day Texas mainly, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. Go across Union Bridge or Main Street Bridge or anything. You ever look at the flags? Right there at the Riverwalk. 6 of them. Huh? All 6 flags are flags that have flown over what is present-day Colorado. And the Spaniards were the first. Okay, the French. The truth is that the Spaniards never really established much. They would have a fairly good stronghold on Santa Fe. But their real strongholds were on the continent. They didn't go much really past Mexico City. They were very well established in South and Central America and extremely well established in the Caribbean. But they were concentrating on Central America and Mexico. Why? Because they were convinced that's where all the gold was. And there was a bunch. Yeah, the 7 cities of Cibola. There was a bunch. Of course, the indigenous people, Blueberry and all these guys, they came looking for the fabled 7 cities of gold. And every time they go, oh, that's got to be it, they go up there and go, that's just mud. Oh, no, you missed it. It's over the hill. I mean, these guys led the Spaniards on so many wild goose chases. They actually did establish footholds as far north as the Arkansas River. They did have a fort for a very short period of time down around La Habra. But they never really established anything north of Santa Fe. And Santa Fe was it. But they were here first. And because of their strange version of mercantilism, grab the gold, plant the cross, and split, First of all, they were brutal. They were brutal with the indigenous people. Nobody knows how many people were killed.
For Mexico City sits today, that was Excelacon or something like that?
That was the original Texaco, which was
Montezuma, right?
Montezuma's cap. Exactly.
And that was exciting. Like, it was pretty much a metropolis.
Oh, let me tell you guys that some of the Aztec culture, the Mayan culture, these guys, they were extensive. Now, one of the things, I'm just going to throw this out. One of the things that is kind of a misnomer is that the existing peoples in the New World, they weren't as culturally advanced. They most certainly were. The Europeans got the idea that they weren't culturally advanced because they weren't technologically advanced. But, you know, these guys, when they landed on the eastern seaboard of North America, these guys were living in houses with chimneys and all of that stuff. They weren't out here. Our general concept is the Navajos and the Apaches, and of course the Arapahoes, Cheyennes, people around our area, and they were still pretty much hunter-gatherers. How come?
Well, I think a lot of it was weather and climate and stuff like that, too. They follow the animals.
Climate and geography are the two greatest influences on us. And when you're living out here, living the hunter-gatherer life, it's not very hard. Well, it wasn't. Because buffalo gave them everything they needed, and there were a lot of buffalo. And actually, when we hear about buffalo hunts and things like that, there was an ulterior motive for that. And they knew that the white guys knew that all we have to do is get rid of the buffalo and we get rid of the Indians. But in places where we had vegetation and all of that, the cultures, the civilizations were just as advanced as they were in Europe. Just because they didn't have the technology doesn't mean their cultures were advanced. Another problem that came about, especially in North America, was a different concept in land ownership and in culture in general. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, they didn't have the concept of land ownership. Now, if you get, anybody want to major in poli sci here? Political science? What? I turned you all on. You in political science, and you start looking at comparative governments, and one of the things I'm going to tell you right off the bat is you can't have democracy without the idea of property ownership. The idea of democracy is based on the idea of property ownership. That's why some of these fledgling democracies where they're really still dictatorships aren't working, because people really, the average guy can't own property. The folks that the Europeans found when they got here, they didn't have that concept of property ownership. And the people that were landing here, they were actually the people that are going to give birth to the idea of democracy. We didn't talk about that, did we? Let's do that real quick. We will talk more about the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. But what happened was, as the Scientific Revolution grew, people started looking into the whys and wherefores. 1200, why was that star up there? Because God put it there and the angels told him. Why did I get sick? Because you pissed God off. I'm serious. And with the I hesitate to use the word follow the church, but that's really what it was. Then that grip on superstition. Superstition loses its grip. And people start doing scientific endeavors. And of course, one of the first ones they do is astronomy, which the Eastern cultures have been doing for millennia. But they go into medicine, they go into electricity, they go into all of these things. And I'll use astronomy for example. A guy by the name of Kepler comes along. Well, a guy by the name of Galileo comes along. He says, you know, I've been observing this thing, and I don't think that the sun goes around the earth. I think it's the other way around. And of course, this was before the church lost its all-powerful grip. And the church forced Galileo to retract. Or then we killed him. A little while later, when we start seeing the scientific revolution really getting into high gear, guys come along and they go, oh, this is really what's happening. Copernicus invents a telescope so we can look and find out that the moon is something more than this celestial disk that put up there, I guess, for our entertainment. Astronomy advances. Along comes a guy by the name of Kepler. And he says, you know what? Not only are there laws, natural laws, he called it, governing the paths of all these planets, but I got mathematical formulas I can show you. If it works for this one over here, it'll work for this one over here, it'll work for this one over here. And so we start seeing the concept of natural law. We're going to go over this a lot more in depth a little bit later on. But for now, I'm just going to give you the basics of it so you can understand why there were such drastic differences and between Europe and the United States, or the Americas, and between the settlers in America and the people who were already here. This went on in medicine and, you know, the study of electricity and all kinds of other things. Actually, eventually it goes into economics. Adam Smith. And then there's another guy, his name's John Locke. And he says, wait a minute, if there's natural laws governing all this other stuff, maybe there's natural laws governing government. Okay. Well, before that, you know, you walk up to the king and go, so how come you're king? What do you say? God made me king. Yeah, I didn't vote for it. Anyway, he and some other people, Bacon and Hobbes and Rousseau, came up with the idea that it was natural law that the only justifiable government, the only legitimate government, was government by consent. Well, there's a concept. And it was a brand new concept. I know, they keep telling me that Greece was the cradle of democracy. Why do we have government in the first place? Government. Yeah. Any campers? You like to camp? Where do you camp? I mean camping. I mean way out. Nobody around, right? Yeah, I love camping in Baca County because I know it, but besides that, I can camp down there. I know there's nobody near. There's nobody 30 miles. Well, I can go down there and I can camp. Ultimate freedom. I can do anything I want, right? Well, within reason, I take care of the land. I don't want to start any fires. You know, morning comes along and there's nobody around. I can get out, wearing what God gave me, take a sponge bath, put on the coffee, you know. You can't do that. Night, I can sit around, play my fiddle, my guitar. Nobody throws rocks at me. I got total freedom. I don't need a gun. Whenever somebody pulls in next to me, things change. Then we don't have the wilderness anymore, we have the frontier. And he and I got to come with some agreements. You know, I won't get out of the tent buck naked in the morning and we'll turn off your generator by 10 o'clock at night. And as more and more people show up, we end up with more and more governance, in order to maintain safety, in order to maintain order. Well, this idea of government by consent was brand new. And we've been doing divine right rule for millennia. And it wasn't well accepted. There were a few people that said, "Well, John, maybe that's something there. I don't know." But for the most part, they said, "That's preposterous. You can't do that." Well, one of the things that the Europeans realized, certainly especially the British realized, was they needed to populate these colonies, or the colonies weren't going to do much good. So the colonies, they needed people in the colonies to produce the raw materials and to buy the finished goods. And they started by 1600 sending people to colonize their colonies. Roanoke, Jamestown, and of course, Plymouth. And these guys got off the boat in Plymouth and went, "Oh, here we are. Yep, we're here. How are we going to get along? We're going to make sure we got some rules so we can get along." And they sat down and they wrote the Mayflower Compact. It was the first social contract.
What was it called? Mayflower what?
Mayflower Compact. Like I said, they all had a hand in it. And one of the things it had in it was, by the way, this is the first, if you will, constitution ever. First social contract ever. They could have never done it over in England because nobody would have gone for it. But over here, there wasn't anything here. And you know, they looked around and said, "Well, we're a small group. Can't we get together and just agree to agree?" And most people, all the way up until the formation of the United States, didn't believe that it would work for a large group. Some people over here don't believe it will now. Anyway, one of the big things in that social contract was that everybody had a right to property, personal property. And that was taken straight from John Locke, right? When Tom Jefferson plagiarized the Declaration of Independence, and he said, "All men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The only thing he changed was John Locke had said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson was a great plagiarizer. The people in the New World who've been living in the New World didn't have that concept of ownership. was all communal. Another concept that they had they were different on was the idea of leadership. Yeah, both sides kind of had elected leaders. But the thing was that, if you read about the early colonies, there was one leader for that colony. The tribes, first of all, the tribes were loose confederations. But besides that, even within a small tribe, there might be 3 or 4 factions, and so they got 3 or 4 leaders. And the white guys come in and take a look around and go, "Who's the chief?" And the first one to say, "I'm the chief," says, "Okay, sit down, we need to talk." They cut deals with this chief. Yeah, this chief over here is not side. I mean, we can really see this with the Cherokee. The Indian Removal Act ended up with the Trail of Tears. This is in the 1800s. There were 2 major factions in the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee tribe was down in Georgia. And the white guys signed an agreement with a fellow by the name of John Ross. Look, we're going to take the land you're on now. We're going to give you all this prime land down in what they call the Indian Territory. It was actually Oklahoma. And and it's going to be a good deal. Besides getting really good land, which it is, but also, the white guys aren't going to bother you anymore, which they did. And so these guys go back to Washington and go, "Well, that takes care of that." And John Ross and his people pick up and go to Oklahoma, and everybody's happy, except for the other faction of the tribe, led by a guy by the name of Blue. And he says, so along comes our friend Andrew Jackson, who was attributed to saying being a good Indian and a dead Indian. He says, "You guys haven't left yet." So he signs the Indian Removal Act, sends the army down. The army rounds up the rest of them, force marches them to Oklahoma, and that's called the Trail of Tears. But these guys are walking along going, "Wait a minute, I never signed that agreement." And it was a total misunderstanding, a totally different concept of leadership. A neat little aside is that, this was 1823. They got down there, and after that, the Boudinais contingent and the Ross contingent, they did not get along. But too many years after that, the United States breaks out of Civil War. John Ross ends up in Washington. He is a big mooshy-moosh in the federal government. And Boudinais ends up as the only Native American general in the Confederacy. So they even fought on opposite sides during the Civil War.
To the first colonists and stuff like that, isn't it safe to believe that the majority of the first colonists were Europe's riffraff or undesirables?
You know what? It's
the majority of them.
I'm gonna tell you this, especially in Roanoke and Jamestown. It was the best and the worst. There wasn't much in the middle. Because what happened was a lot of the guys signed on to get out of debtor's prison. And a lot of those guys got their way paid by the other half who were looking for service and stuff like that. And they were some of the elite. A lot of them were fallen elite. Remember that England had just been through a whole bunch of civil war and everything else, and a lot of the formerly wealthy families had lost that everything. And they saw the New World as a chance to rebuild fortunes. But you don't see a lot in the middle. Yes, sir?
Wasn't a lot of the migration from Europe to the New World because of religious freedom also?
I hesitate to say a lot. The ones we think of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony. They were both that. The thing is that, along came, let's just get this over with. Okay, we'll forget about that for the rest of the day. Along comes Henry VIII, and he is really concerned with the male heir. And he keeps going through wives because they won't give him male heirs. He doesn't understand. It's not her fault. It is his fault. He's the one with the Y chromosome. Interestingly enough, he does bear 2 daughters for incredibly powerful women. And probably either one of them would have been the most remarkable monarch in history. But Liz got the upper hand and she couldn't marry. But he goes to the Pope and keeps asking for divorces. And finally the Pope says no, and he goes, okay, screw you. I'll start my own church. Well, no, not really. Episcopalianism. Yeah. He starts the Episcopal Church. The only difference between the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church's Pope is the Pope, and the English Church's Pope is the King. Yeah, and they allow divorce. The thing is that this is during the time of the Protestant Reformation. And of course, there are a lot of different sects growing up, a lot of different religious sects. And it's kind of the end thing. There are 2 sects in England that are certainly not affiliated with the old church, but they feel like the Anglican Church hasn't gone far. They are separatists and there's no difference between them, except that the separatists say, no, these guys are too far gone. There is no way that they're ever going to be saved. We got to be saved. Thanks anyway, but we're going to the new world. And the other group said, and they believed that what they were going to do was, by their example, they were going to show the English church where they'd gone wrong. And then they were going to set what they called the city on the hill. And everybody in England would go, oh, yeah, okay. That was the only difference between the two. Although they fought like that throughout. What eventually is going to happen is, forming new churches is conducive to forming more new churches. And when they get to especially Massachusetts, all of a sudden some people are going, yeah, well, we're not so sure you're right. And these guys weren't real receptive to rule change. And so we're going to split. And they did. And the 2 main groups, one was led by Ann Hutchinson and the other was led by Roger Williams. They went to Rhode Island, and Rhode Island to this day is known for its open-mindedness. And they started colonies in Rhode Island, but anybody was welcome. Jews were welcome. Catholics were welcome. And this was exactly the opposite of the colonies. The first colonies that came over for religious reasons, they didn't come over to give religious freedom. They came over to get it, but they weren't going to give it. My good friend Charlie Corral, who's gone now. Good night, Charlie. He worked for CBS on the road. In this program called On the Road. And all he did was they gave him a cameraman and a sound man and an RV. And said, go get stories. And years. You can still find them in the library. But he always used to say, every city's got the first Baptist church. Providence, Rhode Island has got the first. And if you look at it, especially the United States, you go, gosh, look at the proliferation of different churches we have. And that's how we got started. You know, there's the old story about the Pilgrims coming over on the boat, and they hit a violent storm. After it's over, they look around, and John the Carpenter's missing. He must have been washed overboard. Well, sorry, John. Nice one. And a couple of years later, they're coming back, and they look over, and there's this island, and there's this whole town on the island. So they pull in. John, we thought you died. No. I managed to swim over here. Well, what's all this? You know? Well, you know, I had everything else on the carpenter, you know, I got my tools. Nice. So that's my house. What's that? Well, you know, if I ever get married, my in-laws are going to be a place to live. And what's that over there? Well, that's the general store. This thing was all laid out. What's that over there, John? He goes, oh, that's the first church. What's that down there? Well, that's the second church. We just couldn't get along. You know, isn't that the story of America? How did we get there? It was your fault. I know it was your fault. The other side, I remember now, the other side is all financial. Go back to mercantile. And while the Massachusetts colonies were originally faith-based, and there were two primary ones. There was Massachusetts, Maine, and Cuba. They didn't last long. Probably one of the reasons they didn't last long is because they were so intolerant. The rest of them were primarily financial endeavors. Here's what's going on. We got the start of the Industrial Revolution. One of the things it creates is a middle class. And a middle class with money to invest. And they look around for investments, and one of the places where we can invest is in And so we see the rise of things called joint stock companies. They work for everything. I can invest in a ship. You know, I back the ship, give them money to sail and everything. They run around and they do all the trading, and I get a lot of profit. But if I get unlucky and the ship sinks, I take all the loss. And most people are not willing to face that risk. So they start joining stock companies, which are basically our stock market is modeled after today. A bunch of people get in, they all put in a little money, they all share the profit, they also share the risk. And when we look at Jamestown, and Jamestown was really the first. Jamestown's got a bad rap. All through American history, people said, Jamestown, you know, they all came over here. It failed because they all ran off there looking for people. Jamestown was a very, very successful community for a number of years. We think now what happened was, back in those days, they didn't realize that you don't swim in the same water you drink. And it was probably drastically hampered by health matters. The reason that historians for so many years thought that Jamestown was a flop was because they were taken in the wrong place. The Jamestown River was changed course. I'm digging over here. The real Jamestown's over here. When they finally found the real Jamestown, they went, oh, as time goes on, the real money, and especially the democratic money, if you will, is going to end up in the north. Primarily because, remember, I was talking about crops being labor intensive. The South is absolutely perfect for all these labor intensive crops. And that almost dictates that one person be in charge of a large area. And that's what we find in the South. We find a situation very, very similar to the feudal systems in Middle England, Middle France, Middle Germany. In the north, it's rocky and hilly, not really great for a big farm. The truth is that slavery takes hold in the South and not in the North, not because the Northerners are bad, because slavery is not economically feasible. So they turn, well, first of all, what happens is that very strict adherence to the church elders and all of that, it doesn't work, it drives people out. And they start weakening the church. One advantage they do have is the Puritans and the Separatists that are over here, they have a different concept than the original church had. And the idea was, you know what? Your salvation is a matter between you and God. You need to develop a personal relationship with God. This is totally different from 1,000 years of the old church. And they say, you know what? The only way you're going to get to know God is to read the Bible, and the only way you're going to read the Bible is to learn how to read. And most of the New England communities passed laws, and I love the name of these laws. They call them the Old Deluder laws. Who's the Old Deluder? Old Nick, huh? Devil. And all children had to be taught to read in order to read the Bible. And the result of that was that the New England colonies had a literacy rate probably higher than we've got in the United States today. So that gave them a leg up when it started coming to trade, business, stuff like that. And they had most of the raw materials. The only thing they didn't have was cotton. So most of the trade was happening with the northern states, northern colonies. And the North started getting into building ships and stuff like that. And the democratic money, and I'm using that term because I can't think of a better term to use, started flowing. That's where all the democratic money was. In other words, if you were coming from England or you wanted to be upwardly mobile, you weren't going to go to Georgia. Because at best, you're going to end up poor white trash. But in the north, you had a shot at it. There was still land available, and as land became less and less available, you could still keep going. In the south, you can forget it. One guy controls a vast area of land, and he's not going to let go. Does that make sense? That's the English model. Now, you have to understand that until after the Revolutionary War, there is very, very little settlement past the people. Almost everything is within 60, 70 miles of the seashore. Some of that, by the way, is by royal decree. King George is getting tired of putting down the Indians and stuff. The French, on the other hand, they're not nearly as intrusive. They don't require a lot of raw materials, and they aren't shipping a lot of people in. And while they are a lot more evangelical than the British are, and remember, they're Catholic. They're not very forceful. And they figured something out that would make them welcome as evangelicals. And they sent their priests in, not so much as priests, but as teachers. Education. Education. We jump ahead a few hundred years, and we see one of the big first lawsuits that comes before the Supreme Court. There's a thing called Worcester versus Georgia. And Worcester was the leader of the Baptists. I ever wonder why you get down south and the Baptists are usually the dominant religious people in the South? Figured it out a long time ago. You had to have permission to go on Indian land. And, you know, the Indians were all that hep on having Christians coming in and trying to convert them. They wanted education. And so the Baptists said, we want to set up schools. We want to send in teachers. And the tribes didn't try. That's how they got to do it. But as I said, they weren't that, because they built expensive things, but they didn't require a lot of intrusive exploitation of raw materials. As a matter of fact, the one thing that was primarily on their sights and their targets was pelts, beaver pelts. Why are they so valuable? In the 1700s, if you were a young man on the streets of Paris or London or Leningrad or any place else, and you didn't have a beaver hat, you just were a stud. And the demand for beaver was incredible. And the French exploited that to the point where if we look at the original Europeans in our area, in the mountain area, most of the mountain men were French. Jean St. Grain, Jacques Laramie, all those guys. And as I said, I'm not going to say that they really got along with the indigenous folks, but I will say that they got along with them a heck of a lot better than the English, because they weren't as intrusive. Along comes the mid-1700s, when basically we have a European-wide war, and it spills over into the Americas, and the tribes side with the French against the English. That's the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. The Spaniards, of course, we've already done them to death. They're down there, they're not popular, but that's all right, because they managed to kill just about everybody. And they're not the only one. The other thing that we have to understand is the indigenous population of all the Americas drops dramatically. Some of it is warfare, most of it's disease. These Europeans are showing up, and at least at first, they're not trying to kill these guys, but they're carrying viruses and bacteria that the New World people have never encountered, and they have no immunity to whatsoever. And depending on what area you're talking about, the indigenous population dies off from anywhere from 50 to 90%. They figure in 1500, the indigenous population of Mexico, Central America was somewhere between 10 and 20 million. By 1800, it was less than 10 million.
But a lot of that was.
I'm sorry, did I say 10? I meant to say 1.
A lot of that was intentional. That was first.
Yeah, a lot of that's urban legends. I mean, some of it really happened, but not a lot of it's urban. So I guess that kind of wraps up what we're talking about with the invasion of the New World. As the New World perks up, the Old World is going to kind of fall by the wayside, but it's going to take a long time. And the Eastern world, because a lot of people see parallels between the grip of the Islamic faith as it starts its stranglehold on the Eastern world with what the Christian faith did to Europe during the Middle Ages. Maybe so. One more thing I might as well throw in and get it over with today. Spain, as I said, has been on a long downhill slide. She's had serious internal economic problems, mainly because, first of all, there's gold coming in, and then the government starts setting the price of gold. People start hoarding it, and it's worth a lot more outside of Spain than it is inside of Spain. So they start smuggling it out, so there's a huge gold drain all of a sudden. And then the King of Spain, and oh, by the way, Spain does rule the waves. And then the King of Spain says, boy, you know those upstart Englishmen, maybe I better put a stop to that before they get carried away. And so he sends pretty much his whole fleet to England to simply